Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Let's talk some New York Mets. It's been an interesting couple of days for those New York Mets. They don't have a manager. I can now die and say that I had the same record as Carlos Beltran as a manager, 0-0. Hey, today's a win. But before I get into the current Mets, let's talk about how they did in 2019. In 2019, they finished 13th in runs scored, 11th in team ERA, and 19th in fielding percentage. They had a couple of great players from last year. Jacob DeGrom won the Cy Young Award in the National League. He finished with an 11-8 record and an ERA of 2.43. And Pete Alonso came out of nowhere last year with 53 home runs, which is a Mets franchise record, and it was the rookie record for home runs in the major leagues. Overall, the Mets finished third in the NL East. They finished 3 games behind the second spot in the NL wildcard. They did get really hot at one point, and Mets fever was just boiling over everywhere. Everyone was a believer in the Mets, but they just fell short. The Mets just got off to a tough start in the season, and I just think in the end, they ran out of time and they just couldn't make up for it. So let's move on to the offseason. As you all know, Carlos Beltran is no longer the manager of the Mets, so the Mets are actively looking for a manager to replace him before spring training. Some candidates are bench coach Hensley Mullins. You have quality control coach Luis Rojas. There's also first base coach Tony DeFrancisco. There are some veteran guys out there like Buck Showalter and, dare I say it, even Terry Collins. Maybe he could even come back for a year or two. The Mets did have one pretty big departure in Zack Wheeler. He signed a big deal with the Philadelphia Phillies. But in my opinion, over his career, he's dealt with a lot of injuries. He signed for big money with the Phillies. I think it was a smart move for the Mets to walk away from Zack Wheeler, especially because during the season at the trade deadline, they made a big, surprising trade for Marcus Stroman. As for additions this offseason, they've added Rick Porcello, Michael Wacha. They made a trade for Jake Mrazek, and they signed Dellin Betances. So overall, I think the Mets had a really good offseason, minus the whole Carlos Beltran thing. But let's talk 2020. Let's talk about their strength right off the bat. That rotation could be one of the best in baseball. You got Jacob DeGrom, Noah Syndergaard, Marcus Stroman as your 3. That's pretty good. If you're going into the playoffs with that 3, I'd be pretty confident. Steven Matz had a productive season last year. He will be a very good number 4. Then you've also added Rick Porcello and Michael Wacha. If I'm going to go between Rick Porcello and Michael Wacha, I'm going to pick Rick Porcello for that 5th spot. That guy he stayed healthier the last few years. He just won a Cy Young Award a few years ago. He will eat innings, and I think Michael Wacha is going to be better suited for that bullpen. And I really expect Rick Porcello to have a pretty decent season this year with the Mets. He had a pretty rough season last year with the Red Sox, so I think he is due for a bounce-back season. I think a change of scenery is going to help him. I think going to the National League is going to help him. So overall, I think that was a really good signing for the Mets. Moving on to their lineup, I think they have a very good lineup this year. As I said earlier, Pete Alonso had the 53 home runs last year. He's going to be right there in the middle of the order. Pete Alonso was really good last year. He finished 10th in WRC+. There's Michael Conforto behind him. Mets fans seem to not know what to think about him, but at the end of the day, the guy hits home runs. He drives in runs. So I think he's great to have in your lineup. He does strike out a little bit, but hey, the guy drives in runs. There's other pieces in that lineup too with Jeff McNeil, JD Davis. Those guys get on base a lot. Jed Lowrie, who missed the entire season, should be back and healthy going into 2020. And don't forget, I know he's not as good as he used to be, but you still have Robinson Cano at the bottom of that order. Overall, I think that lineup is going to be pretty good. Moving on to the bullpen. That was the biggest weakness of the Mets last year. Edwin Diaz was terrible. Juris Familia was no good. However, the Mets did make one big signing in the offseason that I mentioned earlier, Dellin Betances. He had a nightmare 2019 where he had an injury to his lat, his shoulder. He tore his Achilles at the end of the year. But even though the Mets bullpen was pretty bad, they had guys like Seth Lugo, Justin Wilson, who had pretty solid seasons. So if you can get Edwin Diaz right, Juris Familia right, if you can get Dellin Betances healthy, keep Seth Lugo and Justin Wilson solid, that bullpen could be really good. Edwin Diaz is way too talented to be that bad. I see him having a pretty good year. Overall, my prediction for the Mets this year is they finish with the second wild card spot. I really like the Mets this year. I like their team. I like the energy they had last year. You have added some great pieces. Marcus Stroman at the trade deadline, Rick Porcello, Michael Wacha, Dellin Betances. You traded for Jake Mrazek, who will give you some outfield depth. You obviously have the Cy Young winner, Jacob DeGrom, and you got Noah Syndergaard, who's pretty good too. He'll be right behind him. That lineup has Pete Alonso with his 53 home runs from last year. They got Michael Conforto. They got other pieces. They got guys that can play all around the infield and the outfield. I think the Mets in 2020 are going to be pretty good, and I think they lock down that second wild card spot. They just got to find a manager who is not going to steal signs. But that's just my opinion. Tell me what you think down below in the comments. How do you think the Mets are going to do this year? Do you think they're going to miss the playoffs? Do you think they're going to make the playoffs? Do you think they're going to win the World Series? If you like today's video, drop me a thumbs up. If not, drop me a thumbs down. Feel free to subscribe if you're looking for more baseball insight. That's all I have for today. As always, have a great day, and I'll talk to you next time.